The rifle was already raised when Pearl Carver stepped down from her horse, and the man holding it did not look like the kind of man who made idle threats. "You have come far enough." His voice cut across the dry Arizona air like a blade drawn slow from a scabbard, deliberate and without apology. "State your business or turn that horse around, because I will not ask twice." Pearl did not move. Not backward, not forward. Her boots were cracked from 3 days of hard riding. Her dress was the color of red dust, now rather than the pale blue it had started as in Santa Fe. And her hands, though trembling, did not reach for anything. She had not survived the last 6 weeks of her life by making sudden movements in front of armed men. "My name is Pearl Carver," she said, and she was proud of the steadiness in her voice even when nothing else in her felt steady at all. "I was told this was the Holden Ranch. I was told I was expected." The man lowered the rifle exactly 1 inch. Not enough to feel safe, just enough to feel assessed. He was tall in the way that land makes men tall, not in stature alone, but in the way he stood against it, as though the desert behind him had grown him out of itself, red rock and iron sky, and a silence that did not bother apologizing for what it was. His jaw carried 3 days of dark growth, and his eyes, when Pearl finally steadied herself enough to look at them directly, were the deep gray of a storm that had not yet decided what it intended to do. "This is not the Holden Ranch," he said. Pearl felt the bottom of her stomach drop clean through the earth. "This is the Walden Ranch," the man continued, his tone carrying no particular cruelty, just fact, the way you tell someone that the river flooded and their path home no longer exists. "Holden's property is 12 miles east of here. You have been riding the wrong direction since you crossed Cutter's Creek." Pearl turned and looked behind her, as though the landscape might rearrange itself and prove him wrong. It did not. The desert stretched out in every direction in an indifferent, enormous silence, and the sun was already beginning to sink toward the western ridgeline, and she was 12 miles from where she was supposed to be, alone, with no water left in her canteen, and a horse that had been limping on its right foreleg since mid-afternoon. When she turned back to face the man, he had lowered the rifle the rest of the way. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately name, something that sat between wariness and something else, something she did not have the energy to examine. "Come inside," he said, and the words clearly cost him something. "Before the sun finishes setting." Pearl Carver had not intended to arrive at the wrong ranch. She had not intended any of this, which was the cruelest irony of all, because for the first time in her 26 years, she had actually made a plan. It had started 6 weeks earlier in St. Louis, Missouri, in a small room above a dress shop where she had worked for the better part of 4 years, taking in alterations and embroidering flowers on the collars of women whose lives were shaped by choices rather than circumstances. Pearl's life had been shaped almost entirely by circumstances, starting with a father who died of fever when she was 9, a mother who remarried badly twice, and a series of jobs that kept her fed but never forward. The plan had arrived in the form of a letter, or rather, it had arrived in the form of an advertisement in the Missouri Republican, which Pearl had been reading in the back of the dress shop, while Miss Denning thought she was letting out the seams on a widow's Sunday dress. The advertisement was simple, and in the way of simple things, devastatingly effective. A rancher in Arizona Territory sought a capable, hard-working woman of good character for the purposes of matrimony and household management. Correspondents welcomed. One Thomas Holden, Holden Ranch, Cutter Creek vicinity, Arizona Territory. Pearl had looked at that advertisement for a long time. She had turned it over in her mind the way you turn a stone looking for what might be underneath it. She was not a romantic. She had seen too much of what romance looked like in practice to maintain any particular illusions about it. But she was 26 years old and she was tired in a way that sleep did not fix, tired of the small room and the borrowed light and the sense that her life was happening at a great distance from where she actually was. So she wrote the letter. And Thomas Holden wrote back. And they exchanged 6 letters over 4 weeks, each one more promising than the last, and he had sounded decent in print, careful with words in a way that suggested he meant them, and he had sent money for the stage to Santa Fe and for a horse from there. What he had not done, Pearl now understood, was provide directions that accounted for the fact that Cutter's Creek branched 3 miles south of the Post Road, and that the Eastern Fork and the Western Fork looked identical to someone who had never been to Arizona Territory before. She had taken the Western Fork. She had ridden toward the wrong ranch. And now she was sitting at a rough-hewn table in the kitchen of the Walden property, drinking water from a ceramic cup, while the man who owned it stood at his stove with his back to her and heated something in a cast-iron pan that smelled like beans and dried beef. Peter Walden. She had gathered his full name from the young ranch hand who had been in the yard when she arrived, a boy of about 17 named Cal who had helped with her horse and looked at her with the particular wide-eyed openness of someone who did not encounter visitors often. Peter Walden had not offered his full name himself. He was not, she was learning, a man who offered things easily. "There is a sleeping room off the hall," he said, still with his back to her. "It was my foreman's before he moved his family into the south pasture cabin. It is empty and it is clean, and you are welcome to use it until morning. After that, I will take you to Holden's property myself." "That is very kind of you," Pearl said. He turned then and looked at her, and the expression on his face was complicated in a way that made her sit up straighter. "It is not kindness," he said, and he said it without heat. "It is the only sensible thing. I cannot put a woman out in the dark 12 miles from where she needs to be." "Then I thank you for your sensibility," Pearl said, and something about the way she said it, dry and measured, made a small change in his expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. He set the pan on the table between them with a folded cloth beneath it and 2 tin plates and 2 forks, and he sat down across from her, and they ate. It should have been awkward. It was in some ways. But the silence that Peter Walden carried was not the hostile kind. It was the silence of someone who simply did not manufacture noise for the sake of social comfort, and Pearl, who had spent years surrounded by women who talked constantly in the way of people who were afraid of what they might hear if they stopped, found it unexpectedly bearable. "How long have you been in correspondence with Holden?" he asked, when the plates were half empty. Pearl looked up. 2 months, Peter nodded slowly. He was looking at his plate, turning his fork in his hand in a small, deliberate motion. "He is a decent man," he said finally. "Honest enough, works hard, has a good property." There was something in the pause that followed that Pearl could not interpret. A hesitation, a held-back word. "You sound like you have reservations," she said. He looked at her directly then, and the gray of his eyes was unsettling in the lamplight, not unpleasant, just very present, the kind of gaze that made you feel observed rather than merely seen. "I have no reservations about Holden," he said. "I simply do not know him well enough to speak on him more than I have." Pearl nodded and returned to her food. Somewhere outside, a coyote made its sound against the dark, and the lamp on the table swayed slightly in a draft from somewhere, and the silence settled back in around them like something that had been waiting patiently. She did not sleep well that first night. The room was clean as promised, the narrow bed functional, the blanket heavy and smelling of cedar. But her mind would not quiet itself. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of an unfamiliar place, the settling of the walls, the distant sound of horses shifting in the stable, the wind moving through something it made a low, persistent note against, and she thought about Thomas Holden. She thought about the letters. She tried to remember if she had felt anything particular reading them, anything beyond the practical assessment of a woman who had decided on a course of action. She had found them reassuring. She had found them sufficient. She was not sure she had found them exciting, but she had told herself that excitement was a young woman's currency, and she had moved past being a young woman in the ways that mattered. But she also, in the honest dark of a stranger's spare room, thought about the man who had raised a rifle at her arrival and then set beans and dried beef on the table between them, and the thought had an entirely different texture, sharp and unexpected, like finding a stone in soft ground. She pushed it aside. She was here for a purpose. The wrong ranch was a complication, not a revelation. Morning came gold and enormous, the way mornings in Arizona territory apparently always did, as though the sun was making a personal point. Pearl washed her face at the basin in her room, which had been filled with fresh water that she had not heard anyone bring, pinned her hair into its most presentable arrangement, and emerged to find the kitchen already occupied. Peter Walden was at the table with a cup of coffee and a folded document he was reading, and across the kitchen, a woman of about 60 was working at the stove, with the efficiency of someone who considered idle movement a moral failing. She introduced herself as Rosaria without pausing in what she was doing, and Pearl understood from her accent and the ease with which she moved through the space that she had been here a long time. "Sit," Rosaria said, in a tone that suggested it was not optional. Pearl sat. Peter looked up from his document and nodded at her. "Sleep well." "Well enough," Pearl said, which was more charitable than accurate. He returned to his document without pursuing the matter, and Pearl thought again that she had never met a man who so thoroughly did not perform social pleasantness. It was strange. It was, she realized with some discomfort, something she found she liked. Rosaria put coffee in front of her and then eggs and cornbread, and Pearl ate with the appetite of someone who had not eaten properly in 3 days, and neither of the others at the table made any remark about this, which she appreciated. "I will be ready to ride in an hour," Peter said, folding his document. "I need to speak with Cal and my other hand, Martinez, about the north fence section first." "I am in no hurry," Pearl said. He looked at her with that direct, assessing quality again. "You should be," he said. "Holden will be expecting you. He may already have sent someone to look." Pearl had not considered this. The thought of Thomas Holden, whom she had not yet met, already organizing a search for her, produced a complicated sensation that she chose not to examine. "Then I will be ready when you are," she said. What happened next she would later understand as the first thread of something she was not anticipating. Not a dramatic event. Nothing that could be pointed to as the moment everything changed. Just a small thing, the kind of small thing that accumulates. She finished her breakfast and carried her plate to the basin, and when she turned, Peter was watching her with an expression that he did not immediately school back into its neutral default, and in the second before he did, she saw something in it that she had no name for and no framework for and absolutely no business noticing. She went outside to check on her horse. The horse, whose name was Nellie and who had been purchased in Santa Fe for the purpose of this journey, had been reshod and her right foreleg examined by Cal, who turned out to be surprisingly capable despite his age and his tendency to stare. Cal had found a small stone bruise and applied a poultice, and said Nellie would be fine for riding by midday, but that morning would be better to rest her. Pearl stood with her hand on Nellie's neck in the morning light and looked out at the Walden property, and for the first time since her arrival, she actually saw it. It was not a grand ranch. It did not have the sprawling, showpiece quality of some of the properties she had seen described in land advertisements. But it had something those descriptions never captured, a settled, worked quality, a sense of a place that had been tended over years by someone who intended it to be here a long time. The fence lines were straight. The barn was solid and well-maintained. The garden beside the main house, which she had not noticed the night before in the dark, was productive and clearly cared for, with late-season tomatoes and some sort of squash she did not recognize. It looked like somewhere a person could put down roots. She thought about Thomas Holden's property, which she had not seen. She thought about the letters and their careful, decent content, and the fact that she could not, right now, call up the feeling of anticipation that should have been carrying her toward them. She was still standing with her hand on Nellie's neck when Peter came out of the barn 20 minutes later, and he stopped when he saw her. "Is the horse all right?" he asked. "Cal says she needs a few hours," Pearl said. "The stone bruise," Peter nodded. He came to stand beside her at the fence, not close, an appropriate distance, and looked out at the same landscape she had been looking at. He was holding a coiled rope in one hand and a battered leather glove in the other, dressed for work in dark canvas trousers and a collarless shirt with the sleeves pushed up past his elbows. "How long have you had this property?" she asked, and she did not entirely know why she was asking, except that the silence had begun to feel like it contained the question rather than prevented it. 11 years, he said. "I came out from Tennessee when I was 22. Worked 3 years on another man's land before I could buy this." 22. 11 years. He was 33 then, 7 years older than her. "That is a long time to build something on your own," she said. "It is," he said, and she heard in the simplicity of those two words something that was not pride exactly but was related to pride, something quieter and more private than pride. "Do you have family?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother passed 3 years ago, father before that back in Tennessee, no siblings." "I am sorry," she said. "It is the nature of things," he said, not dismissively but with the equanimity of someone who had spent time making peace with something hard. Pearl turned to look at him then, and he was already looking at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the morning was enormous around them with its blue sky and its dry golden light and its vast indifferent silence. "I should see to the fence section," he said. "Of course," she said. He walked away, and she watched him go, and she felt the thread of the thing she could not name pull tighter. The morning passed slowly. Pearl helped Rosaria in the kitchen without being asked, and Rosaria accepted the help without making anything of it, just handed her things to chop and stir as though she had always been there, which was its own quiet grace. They talked a little, in the way of women working in the same space, practical things, the way the range worked, the water situation in dry months, the particular difficulties of the territory's summers. "Mr. Walden, he is a fair man," Rosaria said at one point without preamble, in the manner of someone choosing to say something directly rather than letting it be inferred. "He seems so," Pearl said carefully. Rosaria gave her a sideways look that contained several unspoken things and returned to her work. By 11 in the morning, Cal had declared Nellie fit for the journey, and Peter had returned from the north fence, and Pearl gathered her bag and tied it to her saddle and stood in the yard feeling the full weight of what was about to happen. She was about to ride to Thomas Holden's ranch. She was about to meet the man she had agreed to marry. She was about to begin the life she had decided on, the life that was practical and forward-looking and deliberately chosen. Peter came out of the barn on a bay gelding that looked like it could run all day without complaint, and he brought the horse to a stop beside her and looked down from the saddle. "Ready?" he asked. Pearl looked up at him. The sun was behind him and she had to shade her eyes, and in the brightness she could not read his expression clearly. "I have a question," she said, "before we go." "Ask it," he said. "Why are you doing this?" she said. 12 miles is not a short ride. You have fences and work. You do not know me. You could have sent Cal." He looked at her for a long moment. The gelding shifted underneath him, and he stilled it with his knee without taking his eyes from her face. "Because you arrived alone, and 12 miles is not a short ride," he said, "and I would not send a woman I do not know into this country with a 17-year-old boy when I am perfectly capable of seeing her safely myself." It was the most direct thing he had said to her, and it was said without decoration, and it landed in Pearl's chest with a weight that she had absolutely no prepared response to. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto Nellie's back. "Then let us go," she said. They rode east, and the morning became midday around them as they went, and the landscape opened and shifted in the way of the Arizona Territory, enormous and indifferent and breathtaking in a way that Pearl was only now, in her second full day of it, beginning to be capable of actually seeing rather than simply surviving. They did not talk much in the first hour. The trail was narrow in places and required attention, and the sun was high and direct, and conversation felt like unnecessary expenditure. But after they crossed a creek that Peter identified as a branch of Cutter's Creek, where the trail widened and the terrain softened slightly, the silence between them became something different, more voluntary than necessary. "What made you answer the advertisement?" he asked. It came out of the quiet without preamble in that direct way of his, and Pearl had the sense that he had been deciding whether to ask it for some time. She considered the answer. Not the tactful version or the abbreviated version, but the actual answer. "I was tired of the life I had," she said. "Not dramatically tired, just the ordinary kind. The kind where you look at the next 10 years and they look exactly like the last 10 years and something in you decides that is not acceptable." He nodded. He seemed to understand that. "And the territory," he said. "Arizona specifically. I had never been anywhere," she said. "If I was going to go somewhere, it seemed worth going to somewhere entirely different rather than a small variation on the same." A corner of his mouth moved. "That is a reasonable way to think about it." "What brought you out here?" she asked. "From Tennessee." "The same thing, more or less," he said, "though in my case I was 22 and not particularly tired. Just very certain there was something here that Tennessee could not give me." "Was there?" "Yes," he said simply, and she heard in it the 11 years of built fences and the stable and the straight fence lines and the garden with the late tomatoes, and she understood what he meant. They rode on, and the conversation came and went in the natural way of people who are discovering they are comfortable with each other's silences, which is its own kind of intimacy, the quieter and more dangerous kind. They passed a homesteader's claim with a small adobe structure and a kitchen garden, and then a line of cottonwood trees that marked another water source, and then they began to see cattle. And then, around a bend in the trail, a considerably larger ranch than Peter Walden's appeared on the flat ground ahead. Thomas Holden's property was extensive. The main house was substantial and new-looking, with a proper porch and glass windows, and there were multiple outbuildings and a large corral with horses moving in it. And the whole thing had the look of recent prosperity, capital applied carefully to ambitious expansion. Pearl stopped Nellie on the trail and looked at it, and she felt very little. This should have felt like arrival. This should have felt like the destination. She had ridden 3 days and taken the wrong fork and spent a night at a stranger's ranch and ridden another 2 hours, and now she was here, and she felt very little. She became aware that Peter had stopped his gelding beside her and was watching her look at the Holden property, and she became aware that she could not turn to look at him, because if she did, whatever was on her face would be visible. "You can still turn back," he said quietly, and the words were so unexpected and so precisely aimed at the thing she had not said that she felt them like a physical pressure in her chest. She turned to look at him despite herself, and his expression was careful and neutral and very serious, and she could not tell at all what he meant by it, whether it was practical counsel from a decent man or something else entirely, something that had accumulated over the course of a morning's ride and a shared breakfast, and standing together in a yard watching the same horizon. "I cannot turn back," she said. "I made an agreement." "Agreements can be reconsidered," he said, "before they become binding." The words hung between them in the dry midday air. "Peter," she said, and she used his given name without having decided to, and she saw him register it, saw the slight change in the set of his jaw. "Why are you saying this to me?" He was quiet for a long moment. The gelding moved beneath him, and he stilled it, and the horses stood in the trail with the Holden property visible ahead and 12 miles of desert behind. "Because," he said, and then stopped, and she could see the effort in him, the particular effort of a man who does not manufacture words but is reaching for them now because not speaking would be the greater dishonesty. "Because you looked at that ranch just now the way someone looks at a door they are not sure they want to open, and I would rather say something honest and be wrong than say nothing and have you wonder why I did not." Pearl stared at him. The sun was full on her face, and her heart was doing something that she did not have a useful name for. "I have known you for less than a day," she said. "I know that," he said. "That is not sufficient basis for," she began and stopped, because she was not sure how to finish the sentence without finishing it in a direction she had not given herself permission to go. "No," he agreed, and the agreement was not a retreat. It was a man standing his ground without pressing forward, and the restraint of it was somehow more affecting than pressure would have been. They looked at each other in the bright midday heat. "I am going to speak with Thomas Holden," Pearl said. "Because I said I would, and I am a person who does what she says she will do." "I know," Peter said, "but I would like you to wait," she said, "if you are willing. I would like you to wait here while I go in." Something shifted in his expression, something that opened briefly before he controlled it. "I will wait," he said. Pearl rode down to the Holden ranch alone. Thomas Holden was in his yard when she arrived. A man of about 40, solid and sun-browned with a thick mustache and honest eyes, and he came forward with genuine relief when he saw her, clasping her hand and saying her name, and he told her he had been worried and had sent a man looking for her that morning on the Santa Fe road. He was every bit as decent as his letters had suggested. He was warm and practical and clearly genuinely glad she had arrived, and his property was prosperous and well-ordered, and exactly what a capable, hard-working woman of good character could build a life within. Pearl stood in his yard and looked at him and listened to his decent voice telling her about the ranch and the house and the room that had been prepared for her, and she thought, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that she had made a serious error, not in coming, not in answering the advertisement, not in any of the practical decisions that had brought her to Arizona territory. She had made the error of thinking that what she needed was a decision made in the absence of feeling, a choice built on sense and forward thinking and the reasonable assessment of available options. And she had spent 26 years doing everything that way. And it had kept her fed, and it had kept her functional, and it had never once, in any of those years, felt like anything resembling what she had felt standing beside Peter Walden in his yard that morning looking at the same horizon. "Mr. Holden," she said, and her voice was steady, which she was grateful for, "I need to be honest with you." He looked at her with a kind, attentive expression. "Our correspondence was genuine," she said. "My intentions were genuine. I have the highest regard for what I have learned of your character through your letters, and I believe you are exactly the man you presented yourself to be." He was watching her now with something in his eyes that was beginning to understand what was coming. "But I arrived at the wrong ranch last night," she said. "And something happened that I did not expect, and I think if I am to be a woman of good character, which is what your advertisement required, then I cannot enter into an agreement while I am carrying something I have not been honest about, even if that something is something I only learned existed this morning." Thomas Holden was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite hurt and not quite surprise, but something in between, the expression of a man who is a little disappointed and entirely decent about it. "Walden's place," he said, and it was not quite a question. "Yes," Pearl said. He nodded slowly, turned and looked at the mountains to the west for a moment, and then turned back to her. "Peter Walden is a good man," he said. "Quiet but good. Better than most in this territory." He paused. "I am sorry it was not me." "So am I," Pearl said honestly, "in a way." He gave a small, rueful smile. "That is a generous thing to say." She offered her hand and he shook it, and that was all. She rode back up the trail to where Peter Walden was waiting on his bay gelding in the midday heat, and when she reached him, she stopped Nellie beside him and looked at him directly, the way he always looked at her, without decoration. "I told him the truth," she said. "I explained that our agreement could not continue in good conscience." Peter looked at her with an expression that was very careful and very still. "Why?" he said. "Because I am not in the habit of making promises I already know I cannot keep," Pearl said. "And this morning I learned something about myself that changes the nature of the promise." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she held his, and the desert was enormous around them and the sky was vast, and they were two people who had known each other for less than a day, which was absurd and true at the same time. "I do not have a great deal to offer a woman," he said. "It is a working ranch, not a grand one. It is isolated. Winters can be hard." "I did not come to Arizona territory because I was afraid of hard," Pearl said. "No," he said, and that corner of his mouth did the thing again that was not quite a smile. I do not imagine you did. I also, she said, am not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. I told Thomas Holden the truth because it was the honest thing to do, not because I have any expectation of you. That is a very controlled way of approaching a feeling, he said. She looked at him. I have not had much practice with the other kind. He was quiet for a moment and then, neither have I. They sat in the trail on their horses in the Arizona heat, and it was possibly the most unromantic setting imaginable for the beginning of something, and yet the something was unmistakably beginning. Ride back with me, he said. Stay another night. Just one more night, and in the morning if you want to continue south toward Tucson or back toward Santa Fe or anywhere else you have a mind to go, I will not say another word about it. And if I do not want to continue south, Pearl said. He looked at her, and this time he let the expression be what it was, unguarded and serious and carrying everything he had not said in plain language. Then we will figure out what comes next, he said. Pearl Carver, who had spent 26 years making sensible decisions, turned her horse west and rode back toward the Walden ranch beside a man she had known for less than a day. And she felt, for the first time she could remember, that she was going in exactly the right direction. The ride back was different from the ride there. The silence between them was different, warmer and more voluntary. The kind of silence that has made its peace with the feelings that live inside it rather than pretending they are not there. They spoke more freely, the way people speak when the formal negotiation of who they are to each other has been resolved in principle, and what remains is the pleasure of actual discovery. Pearl learned that Peter had not lived entirely alone on the Walden ranch, that he had employed various hands over the years, that Martinez had been with him for 4 years, that Cal had arrived 2 years ago from a broken homestead family in New Mexico territory, that Rosaria had come with the property in a manner of speaking, having worked for the man Peter bought it from, and having elected to stay on because she considered it her kitchen, and no change of ownership altered that fact. Did you ever consider it? Pearl asked. Marriage? He was quiet for a stride or two. Once, he said, when I was 25, a woman in Tucson, her family did not consider a man with a small ranch and uncertain prospects a viable candidate. Her family was wrong, Pearl said, with more heat than she intended. He glanced at her sideways, and she saw amusement in his eyes, real amusement, warm and unguarded, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less weathered, and something that she thought might be what he looked like when the world had not yet required him to be so careful. Thank you, he said, with the small, dry gravity of a man who finds the gift of someone else's indignation on his behalf both unexpected and quietly touching. Did it take you a long time to get over it? She asked. Long enough, he said, and then I had a ranch to build, and that is a useful way of getting over things. I embroidered flowers on dress collars, Pearl said. He looked at her. Was that useful? Moderately, she said. It kept my hands busy. I suppose that is similar to building fences, he said. It is exactly similar to building fences, she said, and they looked at each other, and both of them smiled at once, and it was the first time she had seen him smile properly, without reservation, and it went through her like a clean line of something bright. They arrived back at the Walden property in the mid-afternoon, and Rosaria, who was in the garden when they rode in, stopped what she was doing and looked at Pearl for a long moment before looking at Peter, and then looked at Pearl again. I put your bag back in the room, Rosaria said, addressing Pearl with the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who is not surprised by this turn of events and is not going to waste anyone's time pretending otherwise. Thank you, Rosaria, Pearl said. Cal came out of the barn and stopped short when he saw Pearl, and the expression on his face was one of complete undisguised gladness, which Pearl found so unexpected and so genuine that it made something in her chest ache in a good way. You came back, Cal said. I came back, Pearl confirmed. Cal looked at Peter with an expression that, in a boy of 17 who was not experienced in concealing things, said absolutely everything about what he thought of this development. Peter gave him a look that said he was aware, and that discretion was the appropriate response. And Cal nodded and went back into the barn with the dignified attempt at subtlety of a boy who was not quite pulling it off. The afternoon passed in the ordinary rhythms of the working ranch. Peter and Martinez riding out to check the south section, Cal managing the horses, Rosaria preparing the evening meal, and Pearl, who had somehow arrived at a place between guest and not guest, helped with the kitchen and then took a walk along the edge of the property in the long golden light of the late afternoon. She stood at the fence line at the western edge and looked at the mountains, which were purple and gold in the dying light, and she thought about everything that had happened in the last 36 hours, and she thought about the life she had been traveling toward and the life she was possibly standing at the edge of now, and she thought about what she wanted, really wanted, in the honest way that she had not permitted herself in a very long time. She heard him come up behind her. She always seemed to hear Peter Walden coming, not because he was loud but because something in her had apparently calibrated to him with embarrassing speed. He came and stood beside her at the fence. He did not say anything. They stood together in the dying light and watched the sun go down behind the mountains, and it was one of the most beautiful things Pearl had ever seen, the way the light moved on those purple ridges, gold becoming rose, becoming deep amber, becoming the first violet of coming dark. "I lied earlier," she said, without looking at him. He waited. "I said I was not asking anything of you," she said. "That was the honest thing to say in the moment I said it, and I meant it. But it is not the complete truth, and I would rather be completely honest with you than strategically honest." "All right," he said very quietly. "I am asking something," she said. "Not anything specific. Just the chance to stay for a little while and see what this is. Because I think it is something, and I have spent 26 years not asking for anything, and I am 36 hours into deciding that was a waste, and I would like to start changing it." He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and the last light was on both their faces, and he looked at her with that gaze that was not merely seeing but actually present with her, actually there, and he said, "You have not needed to ask. You have had that from the moment you arrived." Pearl looked at him in the last of the light and understood that this was the truest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. "Even when you were pointing a rifle at me?" she asked. The smile came again, that real, unguarded one that changed his whole face. "I lowered it fairly quickly," he said. "1 inch," she said. "It was a very deliberate inch," he said. She laughed, and it surprised both of them, the way laughing in a new place always surprises you the first time, the realizing that you can do it there too. He reached out and very carefully took her hand in his. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm from the day's riding, and he held hers with a gentleness that was so specifically contradictory to everything his exterior suggested that she felt it in her whole body. They stood like that as the dark came in around them, holding hands at the fence line of his ranch, and it was nothing that could be described as dramatic, and it was one of the most significant moments Pearl Carver had ever experienced. The days that followed had the quality of something being built with great care and deliberate patience, which was, she was learning, the specific manner in which Peter Walden did everything. He did not rush. He did not press. He did not treat the thing between them as a thing to be seized, but rather as a thing to be tended, the way you tend something you intend to last. They rode together in the mornings, ostensibly to check sections of the property, genuinely to be in each other's company in the open air of a landscape that suited them both, that asked nothing of them but presence. They talked in the evenings on the porch after supper, while Rosaria worked inside and Cal and Martinez were in the bunkhouse, and the conversations deepened by degrees in the way that genuine conversations do, moving from surfaces to interiors, from circumstance to character. She told him about her father. She had not talked about her father in years, had packed him away in the practical fashion of someone who understood that grief does not contribute to output. She told him about the man her father had been before the fever, the stories he told, the way he had a name for every weather formation he saw, the way he had made her feel at 9 years old, that she was a person whose inner life was worth taking seriously, and how the loss of him had been the original loss, the one all the others branched from. Peter listened without interrupting, which was the best thing he could have done, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "He sounds like someone who understood that children deserve to be talked to like people." "Yes," she said. "Exactly." He told her about his father, who had been a different kind of man entirely, a hard man, not cruel but relentlessly practical in a way that left little room for anything that could not be immediately used. "He built a good life," Peter said, "and he taught me to work, and he was not unkind. But I grew up understanding that feelings were things you had privately and briefly, and then got on with what needed to be done." "That sounds lonely," Pearl said. "It was what it was," he said, and then, after a pause, "Yes, it was lonely." She reached out in the dark and found his hand on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat on the porch in the dark with the stars enormous overhead and the coyotes making their sounds in the distance, and neither of them said anything more, because they did not need to. At the end of the first week, he asked her if she would like to see the whole property, not just the sections they had ridden together but the far northern section, which required a full day's ride and would mean being out from sunup to sundown. She said yes before he finished asking. They rode north through a landscape that changed as they went, the flat scrub desert giving way to higher ground with more vegetation, juniper and pinon, and stretches of grass that were surprising after the aridity of the lower elevations. He showed her a spring he had found in his second year, a small reliable source that fed a seasonal creek and supported the small number of cattle he kept in the northern section. "This is what made the property workable," he said, sitting his horse beside the spring and looking at the water with the particular reverence of a man in a dry land for a reliable source. "Without this, the north section is useless in dry years." "Did you know it was here when you bought the property?" she asked. "No," he said. "I found it 6 months in. I had already committed everything I had to buying the land. If the spring had not been there, I would have had a significant problem. But it was." "It was," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite religious but had the flavor of it, the gratitude of a man who understands that not all good things were earned. They ate midday in the shade of a juniper tree, dried beef and cornbread that Rosaria had packed, and drank from the spring's output, which was the cleanest water Pearl had tasted since leaving Missouri, and talked about everything and nothing with the ease that had become natural between them in a week. On the ride back in the late afternoon, with the sun dropping toward the ridgeline and the light going golden and horizontal the way it did in the late hours, he pulled his gelding to a stop on a rise and she stopped Nellie beside him, and below them was the ranch, and the smoke from Rosaria's kitchen stove was rising in a thin thread against the blue, and the whole thing looked, in that light, like something a person would want to come home to. "Pearl," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the ranch. Then he looked at her. "I know this is not how it is supposed to work," he said, "and I know you came here for a different purpose, and I know it has been a week." "It has been a week," she agreed. "But I am 33 years old," he said, "and I have not said these words to another person since a woman in Tucson when I was 25, and I said them badly then, and I would rather say them carefully now even if the timing is strange." He paused, and she watched him gather the words from wherever he kept the things he did not say easily. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been, I think, since you stood at my gate and did not back down from the rifle, and I know that is not rational, and I do not need you to say anything in return. I just wanted you to know." Pearl looked at him, and everything in her that had been waiting, in the backmost room of herself, for someone to say exactly those words with exactly that careful and unflinching honesty, felt as though a window had been opened. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been trying to talk myself out of it since the first morning because it seemed like an inconvenient thing to be feeling at the time." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, because it was not a guarded expression or a careful expression, or even the warmer expression she had seen in the past week. It was simply open. Fully and completely open, the way a man looks when he has been waiting a long time for something, and it has arrived. He reached across and took her face in his hands, very gently, his thumbs along her jaw, and looked at her for a moment with that expression, and then kissed her. And the kiss was careful and warm and tasted like the clean spring water and the dry afternoon air. And Pearl Carver, who had ridden 3 days and taken the wrong fork and arrived at the wrong ranch, understood with her whole self that the wrong fork had been the right one all along. They were engaged before the end of the 2nd week. He asked her on the porch in the evening, with no production and no performance, just Peter Walden sitting across from her in the lamplight, and saying that he wanted to marry her, and that he thought they would be good for each other, and that he wanted to ask her properly rather than let it become assumed, because she deserved to be asked. Pearl said yes, and her voice broke slightly on the word, and she did not apologize for it. Rosaria, who had apparently been listening from just inside the door, chose that moment to make an emphatic sound of approval from the kitchen that was clearly not accidental. And Cal, who was nowhere near the porch and could not possibly have heard, appeared from the barn 30 seconds later with a completely unconvincing reason to cross the yard. And when Pearl caught his eye and nodded, his face broke into the wide, unself-conscious grin of a boy who considered this news personally vindicating. They rode to Tucson the following Saturday to speak with the minister there, a decent man named Reverend Anstruther, who married them on the 3rd Saturday, following their visit in a ceremony that was small and honest, and exactly what it needed to be. Rosaria came, dressed in her best clothes with an upright posture that suggested she considered this partially her own achievement. Cal came in a shirt that had been pressed to within an inch of its life. Martinez, who was a man of few words and great dignity, came and stood at the back and looked like he approved. Thomas Holden sent a letter that arrived the week before the wedding. It was brief and decent, as all his communications were, and it said that he had heard the news through the particular information network that small territories maintain, and that he wished them well with complete sincerity, and that he had had further correspondence from a woman in Colorado and was optimistic. Pearl wrote back and told him she was genuinely glad to hear it. The wedding itself was in late October of 1882, with the desert in the season that Pearl was discovering was its most beautiful, the heat having relented and the light lying clean and golden across everything, the sky a blue so intense it almost hurt, and the Tucson minister marrying them in his church with the afternoon sun coming through the plain glass windows in long warm lines. When Peter put the ring on her finger, a simple band of gold he had hidden in his coat pocket for the past week, his hands were steady and his eyes were on hers the whole time, and Pearl thought that she had come to Arizona territory to find a life and had found, entirely against her planning, a home. They returned to the ranch in the early evening, and Rosaria had prepared a meal that was well beyond the everyday, a roasted chicken and cornbread, and something sweet that involved dried apples and spices, and they ate by lamplight, the 5 of them, and it was, Pearl thought, exactly the kind of evening that she had not known she was missing until she had it. Later, when the others had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Pearl sat on the porch with her husband, and the word was new and strange and right, and the stars were out in their full Arizona abundance, which was more stars than Pearl had ever seen in Missouri or anywhere else, a density of light that made the sky feel populated rather than empty. "Are you happy?" Peter asked. She turned to look at him. He was not asking it nervously or performatively. He was asking it the way he asked everything, with a genuine desire to know the actual answer. "Yes," she said, unreservedly. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat in the dark under the stars, and she thought about the wrong fork at Cutter's Creek and the rifle and the beans and the dried beef and 12 miles and a morning yard and the hand on the fence rail, and she thought that if she had taken the right fork, she would have arrived at a good life, a decent life, a life that could have been lived with competence and moderate contentment, and she would never have known what she had missed. The first winter on the Walden ranch was harder than Pearl had anticipated, and less hard than she had feared. There were weeks of cold that surprised her in the high desert, frost in the mornings and wind that had teeth, and the days were shorter, and the work of maintaining the property in the cold months was relentless in ways that the warm months concealed. There were cattle to feed and fences to check, and the water situation required constant management when temperatures dropped. Pearl worked alongside everyone without complaint and without performance. She helped in the kitchen and outside it, learned the land in its winter aspect with the focused attention she applied to everything, and found that the territory's winters, while demanding, had their own austere beauty, the hard blue of cold sky mornings, the frost on the scrub, the way the mountains looked with snow on their upper ridges. Peter watched her in these months with something that she came to recognize as relief, the particular relief of a man who had wondered, privately, whether the woman he loved would be equal to the reality of the life he was asking her to share, and was discovering the answer was yes. They had disagreements. Pearl would not have trusted any relationship that did not, and Peter had a stubbornness that was the shadow side of his determination, a resistance to changing course once he had committed to one that occasionally needed to be brought up short. The first real argument was in February, over Cal. Cal had developed a cough in the deep cold that was lingering too long. Pearl thought he should be taken to the doctor in Tucson. Peter thought it was a winter cold and would pass. Pearl thought Peter was confusing thrift with negligence. Peter thought Pearl was being excessive. The argument was brief and specific, and neither of them said anything unkind. But there was a moment of genuine opposition, two wills in direct contact, and Pearl felt the edge of it and did not back down from it. And Peter, in the end, saw the validity of her concern and took Cal to Tucson. The doctor confirmed it was a developing chest infection that, treated promptly, was nothing serious, and without treatment would have become serious. Peter brought Cal back with medicine and a somewhat altered understanding of the difference between patience and avoidance. He did not apologize in the effusive way of someone performing contrition. He sat down across from Pearl at the kitchen table that evening and said, "You were right. Thank you for pushing on it." And Pearl said, "Thank you for listening." And that was how they argued and resolved things, directly and without drama, and it was one of the ways they were most suited to each other. Spring came to the Arizona territory with the suddenness that seemed characteristic of the place, winter stepping back and the warmth returning almost overnight, and the desert coming to life in a way that Pearl found newly extraordinary every year, the way the scrub produced green, and then the bloom of cactus flowers, red and yellow, and the shocking pink of the beaver tail, and the whole landscape renewing itself with the brisk, unsentimental energy of something that has been through worse. By spring, Pearl was pregnant. She knew before she said anything to Peter, held the knowledge for a week in the way she held all important things first, privately, getting her own understanding in order before she brought it into the shared space between them. She told him on a morning in April when they were sitting at the kitchen table before Rosaria had come in, the early light coming through the window and the day not yet started. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something that went beyond the controlled, careful quality of his usual emotional presentation, and was simply, straightforwardly overwhelmed. He reached across the table and took both her hands. "Are you well?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "completely." "Are you happy?" he asked, and it was the same question he had asked on the porch on their wedding night in the same genuine tone. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his gray eyes something that she thought might be the look of a man understanding that the life he had built over 11 years of fences and early mornings and careful solitude had just become something of a magnitude he had not fully anticipated. "More than I have words for," he said. She laughed and squeezed his hands, and Rosaria arrived and took in the scene with the immediate comprehension of a woman who has been paying attention, and said nothing at all except to ask what Pearl wanted for breakfast, which was the Rosaria way of saying she was glad. Cal, when he heard, looked so delighted that it was almost comic. Martinez shook Peter's hand with a gravity and genuine warmth that made Peter clear his throat and look at the fence line. The pregnancy was not easy. Summer in the territory was brutal in the 3rd and 4th months, and Pearl ran hot and found the heat compounding, and there were weeks of fatigue that she resented but submitted to. Resting in the afternoons on the narrow bed in the room that was now the guest room, with the shutters closed against the sun, and the air moving slow and thick with heat. Peter modified the ranch's work schedule during those months to ensure he was not far from the house for any extended period. He did not announce this as a decision or make any particular production of it. He simply restructured the work so that someone was always within a reasonable distance of the house, and when Pearl noticed and commented on it, he said only that it was a sensible arrangement for the season. Pearl let it be what it was, which was a man rearranging his world quietly around the person he loved, and she was grateful for it in a way that was too large for easy words. The boy was born in November of 1883, 3 weeks before Pearl expected him, on a cold Tuesday morning with the first real frost of the season on the window glass, and a wind moving outside that made the walls sound like they were breathing. Rosaria served as midwife along with a woman from the nearest homestead, a Mrs. Calderon who had 5 children and a calm, practical manner that Pearl found extraordinarily useful. Peter was outside on the porch for most of the labor in the particular tormented state of a man who understands that there is nothing he can do and finds this state nearly unbearable. When it was over and Rosaria came to the porch door and said he could come in, Peter Walden came into the bedroom with an expression that Pearl would remember for the rest of her life. A man walking towards something he had not known until recently that he wanted, wearing it plainly on his face for the first time without any of his careful management. She was in the bed with the baby in her arms, and the baby was small and wrinkled and angry-looking in the way of all newborns, and his eyes were unfocused, and his hands were curled into tight little fists, and he was the most significant thing Pearl had ever done. Peter sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and Pearl watched him look, and the expression on his face was one of the most private, unguarded, complete things she had ever witnessed in another person. "He looks like a very serious man," Peter said, in a very quiet voice. "He looks like you," Pearl said. Peter looked up at her, and she saw in his eyes that the thing she had said had hit him somewhere he had not prepared a defense for, and he looked back at the baby, and then, very carefully, reached out, and the baby's fist closed around his finger with the reflexive grip of the newly arrived. And Peter Walden, who had built 11 years of fences and property lines against the Arizona territory with the controlled patience of a man who kept himself well contained, did not quite cry, but came close enough to it that no one present would have held it against him. They named him James for Pearl's father. James Walden grew into a child of fierce curiosity and remarkable stubbornness, both of which he had acquired from both his parents in equal and enthusiastic measure. By the time he was walking, he was following Cal around the property with a seriousness that Cal found enormously gratifying, and by the time he was talking in full sentences, he had developed specific opinions about horses that suggested a connoisseurship unlikely in a 2-year-old. Peter with his son was one of the things Pearl loved best about the years that followed. Peter was not a demonstrative father, not in the effusive sense, but he was profoundly present, the kind of parent who gets on the floor to be at the child's level and answers questions seriously, and does not pretend that the small person's interior world is less important because it is small. He talked to James the way Pearl's father had talked to her, as though the child's thoughts were worth taking seriously, and watching it, Pearl understood that the cycle of decent parenthood was turning, and the thing her father had given her was now passing forward. Martinez left the ranch in the spring of 1884 to return to his family in New Mexico, and they parted on the terms of men who have worked well together, with respect and a handshake and Rosaria's best tamales wrapped for the road. They hired a new hand, a man named Abel who was in his late 20s and had come up from Texas, and was reliable and quiet and fit into the property's rhythm without difficulty. Cal, who turned 19 in 1885, had grown from an uncertain boy into a capable young man with a steady hand and a good eye for cattle and horses, and Peter paid him accordingly and let him take on more responsibility. And Pearl saw in the way Peter managed this the same careful attentiveness he brought to everything, the understanding that people grow when they are given the room to grow, and the respect to believe that they will. There was a difficult period in 1885 when the territory had a particularly dry summer that threatened the North Section's water supply. The spring diminished in July and August to a level that alarmed everyone, and the cattle in the North pasture needed to be moved south, which required restructuring the whole property's management. Pearl was present for all of it, the discussions at the kitchen table, the decisions about cattle numbers, the conversations with neighbors about shared water access. It was her suggestion, based on something she had read in an agricultural paper that had arrived in Tucson from back east, that they dig a supplementary well in the north section above the spring source, which might help develop the water table. The well was dug in August by Peter and Abel and Cal with tools that made the work brutally slow, and it took 3 weeks, and at the end of the 3rd week, at a depth that had begun to seem like it might be insufficient, they hit water. Clean, cold, reliable water. Peter came back to the house that evening covered in the specific exhaustion of a man who has done something physically enormous, and he told Pearl about the water with the same quality she had heard in his voice, the first time he told her about the spring in the north section, that reverence for the unexpected gift. She cleaned the dirt off his hands at the basin and told him she was glad, and he held her face in his clean, wet hands and kissed her forehead and said, "That was your idea. The general concept was from the paper," she said. "The paper did not know our land," he said. "You do." It was the truest thing Pearl thought that she did. In 3 years she had learned this land the way she had never learned any place in her life. Not the city she had grown up at the edges of, not the shop with its borrowed light, but this specific high desert, its moods and its rhythms and its surprising graces, and it was hers now as fully as it was Peter's, and the recognition of that was its own kind of love. The following spring in 1886, Pearl discovered she was pregnant again. This time she told Peter at once, no week of private processing, just one morning over coffee, "I think we are having another baby." His response was immediate and warm, not the stunned wonder of the first time, but a quieter, deeper gladness, a man who had now experienced the thing and knew its value. "When?" he asked. "December, I think," she said. "James will be 3, he said. "He will," she said. "I suspect he will have opinions about it." James did have opinions about it. Extensive ones, delivered with the characteristic Walden gravity in a high, serious voice, mainly centered on the importance of the baby liking horses, which James considered a fundamental character requirement. The second child was a girl, born on a night in early December when the stars were out in their full desert profusion, and the cold was sharp and clean, and she arrived with considerably less drama than her brother had managed, as though she had assessed the situation and decided not to waste anyone's time with unnecessary complication. They named her Ruth, for Peter's mother. Ruth Walden was from the first a different creature from her brother, quieter and more observational, with dark eyes that she had from her father and a watchful intelligence that Pearl recognized, because it was the same thing she saw in herself. Where James would immediately engage with anything in his vicinity, Ruth would first look at it very carefully for some time, as though establishing a complete picture before committing to involvement. Peter observed this in his daughter, with an expression that Pearl had learned to read as profound recognition. He was 40 years old by this time, and Ruth was his second child, and nothing about the experience of having a daughter had been explained to him in advance, and the particular experience of seeing something of himself in her was, she thought, doing something important to him. James, age 3, regarded Ruth with the serious benevolence of someone who has accepted a significant new responsibility, and the degree to which this proved accurate over the following years was one of the continuous delights of Pearl's life. He was protective without being smothering, attentive without condescension, and the two of them, who were very different people, formed between them the particular bond of siblings who have decided to be genuinely interested in each other. The territory was changing in those years. Arizona Territory was growing as the decade of the 1880s advanced, with more settlers arriving, more towns developing, the railroad having come through Tucson and changing everything about the economy and the movement of cattle. The Walden Ranch, which had operated in a certain productive isolation in the early years, became less isolated as more homesteads went in around it, and the nearest town grew from a scattering of buildings to something with a proper main street, a general store, a post office, a school. Pearl made the school happen, not alone, but she was the primary force of it. She organized the parents in the surrounding homesteads into an agreement, identified a teacher from among the women in the area who had the education and the temperament for the work, raised the money for the building with a persistence that Peter observed with the expression of a man who had known she was capable, but was enjoying the confirmation. When the school opened in 1887, James was 4 and not yet old enough, and Ruth was a baby, and Pearl stood at the door of the small one-room building with its new pine boards still smelling of cut wood, and felt the particular satisfaction of something built with intention in a place that needed it. "You look like someone who just found water in a dry well," Peter said beside her. "I feel like it," she said. He put his arm around her in the morning light, and she leaned into him, and the desert stretched out around the little school building with its patient enormity, and the life they had built was in every direction. The ranch and the land and the children in Rosaria's kitchen and the men at the morning's work. And Pearl Carver, who had arrived at the wrong ranch, felt the fullness of a life that had found exactly the right shape. Rosaria's health began to decline in 1888, not suddenly, but in the gradual manner of advancing years, and Pearl managed this with the same practical attentiveness she brought to everything, adjusting the kitchen work, taking on more of what Rosaria could no longer manage without making it feel like replacement, because replacement was not what it was. It was simply the natural passing of work between people who care for each other. Rosaria, who was not a woman who made declarations, told Pearl one afternoon in the kitchen with the September light coming in through the window without looking up from her work, that the ranch had been in a poor way before Pearl came, not in the material sense but in the other sense, the sense that matters more. Pearl put down what she was doing and said, "Rosaria." Rosaria looked up with the expression of a woman who has said the thing and intends to stand by it. "Thank you," Pearl said. "Work harder," Rosaria said, and returned to the dough she was working. Cal, in 1889, told Peter he had enough money saved to put a claim on a piece of land to the south that had come available, and would Peter advise him on the process. Peter sat with him for an entire Sunday afternoon going through every aspect of the claim, the water rights and the fencing costs, and the cattle numbers, and the management of a first difficult winter, speaking from the precise experience of a man who had done it and knew where the traps were. Pearl brought them coffee and listened from the doorway to a man who had never been given a great deal teaching a young man everything he had learned, and the particular quality of transmission in it, the passage of hard knowledge between people across time, felt important to her in a way she held carefully. Cal filed his claim in the spring of 1889. The Walden Ranch lost its best hand and gained a neighbor, and Peter helped with cows fencing in the first month with the matter-of-fact generosity of a man who does not count what he gives because he does not think of it as a debt system. Rosaria died in the autumn of 1889 in September, when the desert was beginning its slow transition from the brutal summer to the temperate beauty of fall. She died in her room at the ranch, in the bed she had occupied for close to 15 years, with Pearl and Peter both present, and it was, as much as any death can be, peaceful. The loss of her was real and was felt by all of them in different registers. James, who was 6, understood it in the concrete way of children that age, and asked serious questions and cried at appropriate moments and was, Pearl thought, doing the healthy thing of actually feeling it rather than managing it away. Ruth, who was 3, understood less but sensed more, with the particular sonar of small children for the emotional states of adults, and was unusually quiet for a week. Pearl missed Rosaria in the kitchen most immediately, and then in the mornings before the household was awake, when Rosaria had always been the first person she saw, and the silence in those mornings had a specific shape that she had not been prepared for. They hired a woman from the town, a widow named Mrs. Flores, who was cheerful and capable, and had 3 children of her own who she brought to the ranch on working days, which James and Ruth found enormously pleasing, and the kitchen became a different but functional and warm place. The 1890s brought a different Arizona territory than the one Pearl had arrived in. The frontier quality of it was softening in some respects, the rawness of the early settlement period giving way to something more established, though the land itself was unchanged in its essential character, and the work of ranching it remained what it had always been. There were more newspapers now, more connection to the larger country, and the concerns of the nation found their way into the territories more frequently. The labor questions, the economic uncertainties of the early decade, the ongoing conversations about when Arizona might be considered for statehood. Pearl read everything she could access and had strong views on most of it, and the kitchen table discussions between her and Peter in the evenings after the children were in bed were one of the things she loved best about their life. The way 2 people who had both developed their thinking in relative isolation and then found each other could lay out their understandings and work over them together, agreeing and not agreeing and sharpening each other's thinking in the way that genuine intellectual companionship does. Peter was not a demonstrative man in the public sense, had never been and did not become one with time, but in the private space of their life he was, Pearl understood now, a man of deep feeling who had simply been raised without the language for it and had been quietly learning that language for the whole of the years she had known him. She saw it in the way he was with his children, the gravity and the presence of it. She saw it in the way he sometimes, when they were alone on the porch in the evenings, said things that were simple and exact, and so thoroughly what was true that they went straight through all of her defenses without effort. She saw it in the fact that he still, almost 10 years into their marriage, held her hand at the fence line sometimes in the late afternoon light, for no reason except that she was there and he wanted to. James turned 10 in November of 1893, a serious, capable, passionate boy who had his mother's precision and his father's patience and his own specific self on top of those, and whose love of horses had only deepened with the years until it was clear that the land and the animals on it were his particular calling. He spent every available hour in the corral or on horseback, and Abel, who was still at the ranch and had become a steady and trusted fixture of it, had taught him a great deal about the horses in practical terms, and Peter was teaching him the land, the fences, the water, the cattle, all the knowledge of the property accumulated over 20 years. Ruth at 7 was in the school that Pearl had helped build, which had a second teacher now and more students, and she was excelling in all subjects with particular passion for reading and arithmetic, and she had a small, firm personality that reminded Pearl daily of the younger, harder version of herself, the one that had sat in a back room of a dress shop and decided not to accept 10 more years of the same. Pearl looked at her daughter sometimes and felt the particular complicated love of a parent who sees themselves clearly and wishes certain things easier for the child, while also understanding that the quality you see is not a problem to be solved, but a nature to be lived. In the spring of 1894, Pearl and Peter stood at the north fence in the afternoon light, as they had stood there many times in the years before, though the fence was newer now, replaced 3 years ago, and they were different people than they had been at the beginning, older in body if not in whatever it is that does not age. And the mountains were the same, and the sky was the same, and the light did what it always did in the late afternoon, going gold and horizontal and laying itself across the land with the extravagance of something that knows it is beautiful. "Do you remember," Pearl said, "what you said to me the first night I was here?" "I said a number of things," Peter said. "You said I had come far enough," she said, "when you lowered the rifle." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "I meant it practically," he said. "I know," she said, another pause. "It turned out to be true in other ways," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, the long, familiar profile of his face, the gray at his temples now, the lines of the years in the corners of his eyes, all of it so known to her that it was part of what she meant when she thought of home. He turned and looked at her. "You had come far enough," he said quietly. "You were exactly where you were supposed to be." Pearl reached out and took his hand, and he held it the way he always had, firm and warm and like something he intended to keep. And they stood together in the afternoon light, 12 years from the rifle and the wrong fork and the beans and the dried beef, and the thing she had not had a name for that turned out to be the right name for everything. James came across the yard behind them in a purposeful gallop that resolved into a boy of 10 arriving breathless, with the news that Abel thought the bay mare was going to foal tonight. And could father come look? And the moment opened back into the ordinary and particular life that was built around them, and in which they lived. And Pearl walked back across the yard with her son's hand in one of hers and her husband's in the other. And the smoke was rising from Mrs. Flores's stove, and Ruth would be inside doing her reading, and the stars would come out tonight in their full Arizona profusion, and tomorrow would have its fences and its water and its work and its evenings on the porch, and none of it was what she had planned and all of it was what she had needed, and Pearl Carver had come far enough, and she had arrived. She had arrived completely.